Then they gathered. Then they gathered. Say it one time before you take your seat. Then they gathered. Be seated. One of our volunteers, his kids play sports with our kids, and he asked me right at the beginning when he saw me up here sweating on the stage with Chris and John Sal and Jen on stools preaching back in February of 2020, he said, "Is that weird?" I said, "What?" He said, "Learning to preach in an empty room." And I said, "It's not learning to preach in an empty room, it's remembering." Huh? I found out a long time ago, a lot of spiritual growth isn't about learning anything, it's about remembering. Remember who you are. The book of First Simba. No, it wasn't weird at all. It just took me to remember. Like how David said, this is an unusual circumstance with a 9-foot giant whose helmet outweighs me. I really didn't come here to fight, but I do remember how to, because I've done that before. I never fought this before, but I have fought. And so the key in the David and Goliath passage is to realize that the God who delivered me from the paw of the lion and bear will deliver me from the uncircumcised Philistine, that the enemy's changed, but the power that you're fighting in doesn't. So every time that you shift from one stage of your life to another, or one mode of leadership to another, or when you shift in the role that you're playing, like our campus pastors, when everything shut down. And I'm not trying to take us so far back, because I know we just got good news that everything is gonna, and I'm really hesitant to trust it, so I'm kind of just like dipping my toe in, feeling happy about that, But just to go back to that time, a lot of them that were used to hugging people, praying for people, and being with people, basically did the job as if they were hired at a call center. And instead of, to quote the great Lin-Manuel Miranda, the room where it happened, it was all of a sudden the Zoom where it happened. And the adaptation of this church in that time was one of the greatest proofs that I've ever seen in my life of the grace of God upon this ministry. There is a grace for adaptation. There is a grace for adaptation. Just ask Moses, who needed a sign that God was with him. And all of a sudden, the shepherd's staff that he had carried in the wilderness of his decision to kill an Egyptian became the instrument as he threw it on the ground and it turned into a snake, to prove to him that God can change anything. There is a grace for adaptation. Just ask the disciples, who were also in a desert place trying to feed some hungry crowds. Crowds become mobs real quick. I'll talk about that momentarily. So on the verge of that turn, when you realize that a crowd is not a church. A crowd is not a church. Would you please write that down so you can come back to it? A crowd is not a church. That you understand, when the disciples came to Jesus and placed the meager resource, the feeding of the 5,000, into his hand, it became enough as he touched it, as they brought it. There is a grace for adaptation. In your life right now, I want you to know there is a grace for adaptation. There is a grace for you by the supernatural power of the Holy Spirit in God-taught words, what Paul teaches in Corinthians, for us to express in our lives realities that we have no experience of, but God gives it to us as we need it. That's the grace of adaptation. And in Acts chapter 1, particularly, the Holy Spirit of God is coming to these disciples who we listed a moment ago. Peter, James, and John, the famous ones. Philip and Thomas, who make some cameo appearances. Bartholomew. Oh, shout out Bartholomew. Never preached about him before. The women, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his brothers. They're all standing at a moment where is very different than it is for us because everything is changing in their world. It was different to be a disciple of Jesus back then because back then there was a lot of political unrest. It was different. Everybody say back then. You're so quick. It was different back then because back in those times there were many arguments about gender equality, and back then to be a disciple of Jesus was hard. Back then it was complicated because as the Jewish believers were becoming Christians, many within the religious community saw their conversion to Christ as traitorous to their identity nationally. It was different then. People used to divide themselves by things like skin color or custom, and so it was really different then. And the challenge becomes for me to bring you out of this irrelevant context in which the Bible was written. But there is grace for adaptation. And even, I want you to think about this, the way they would experience the presence of God was changing as they stood on the Mount of Olives, which is itself a place of transition. Remember, the olives only become oil as they are crushed. And that's exactly what has happened to the disciples as their tears are barely dried from watching Jesus die. It's only been 40 days, and now he's leaving them for good. You felt like God left you a few times last year. You felt like God left you, like maybe you did something wrong and he took his hand off you. You didn't tell your volunteer team that. I hope you didn't. That's too heavy for your volunteer team to know about if you're a leader. We carry things as leaders, don't we? I'm not just talking about as a pastor. I mean, even if you're a leader in your home or if you're a leader in your business or if you're leading a volunteer team that had a Gideon opportunity over the last year. Do you know what that is? Gideon started with 36,000 and got down to 300 before God gave him the victory. How many of y'all's volunteer teams is coming out of a Gideon season? You still don't look like you're good with it. That's what I wanted to preach to you today about. Then they gathered. Then they gathered. Back then when they gathered, there was no multi-site technology. Back then when they gathered, there was no nonprofit exemption for charitable giving. Back then when they gathered, there was no guarantee that they could worship in safety. And I'm not talking about masks. Back then. And they gathered, which is a miracle in itself that they're together again.